Last Pint Productions presents the New Way podcast. The New Way contains adult content, and new episodes are released most Wednesdays. So back off, man. We're professionals. Listener discretion is advised.
So you were in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah?
Were you in the shit?
Yeah, I was in shit.
Last night, Darth Vader came down from planet Vulcan and told me that if I didn't take Lorraine out, that he'd melt my brain.
Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Everybody wants to be naked and famous. Everybody wants to be just like me. I'm naked.
Will you help teach me about this? What is it? A new way?
Hello and welcome to the New Way podcast, where we break down pop culture so you don't have to. I'm your host, Matt Schenk, and we have something a little different in store for you today. Inspired by Rob Harvilla's genius podcast, 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, we've decided to give you a better understanding of the media that inspired us to start this little podcast. We have each picked a couple of pieces of pop culture media, including movies, television, music, theater, and the like, which have had an impact on us. We will discuss these in depth and separate from one another. And we'll finish up each episode interviewing someone who shares our interest in the subject. So, without further ado, this is 6 properties that explain the New Way.
So all movie fans of a certain age go through a period of emergence or exploration. It's a time when the curtain is kind of pulled back to reveal the types of content you've only dreamed about. But you've heard about on the third grade playground, but you haven't yet experienced. And while I think the specific age is, often varying from person to person, for Nick, I think it was 17 years old. For Matt, it was in utero. For me, it was 9 years old. And what magic was occurring at the age of 9 for me? Well, what opened my eyes? This was the first time I saw a rated R movie. I will elaborate that my first rated R viewing experience was not parent sanctioned. I think very few viewings of rated R movies, or first viewings of rated R movies, are parent sanctioned. But my first viewing of a rated R movie did actually involve my family in a family event. My father was getting remarried on an island off the coast of North Carolina, and there were no cars there, only golf carts. This, of course, led likely to the mass consumption of alcohol with my dad's younger brothers, but also boredom. There was a lot of boredom because nobody could go anywhere or do anything. And to set the scene, it's October 1992. We're at a house on the beach, and my uncle produces a VHS sleeve for The Terminator, James Cameron's original film from 1984, The Terminator. The original Terminator, even though T2 had been released about a year earlier, which, of course, all the cool kids at school had seen and talked about incessantly, but my uncle had brought both films, the original and T2. But I was a good kid, though. I mentioned when they said they were putting it on that I wasn't allowed to watch rated R movies. But my uncles assured me, confidently explained that it wasn't a big deal and that no one would know. I must say, due to my own confidence on the matter and the busy schedule that my family had with the wedding, that I did not get into trouble for the abandonment of the rules. And I watched the first Terminator movie wide-eyed, and I loved every single fucking minute of it. It wasn't until a few months later in 1993 that I saw my second rated R film. Again, also not parent sanctioned. That's the film we're actually going to be talking about today. But I did find an interesting theme here. Of my first 4 rated R films, 3 of them were seminal action classics directed by James Cameron. The 4th of those was Schindler's List. So this was obviously parent sanctioned. I think my mother still probably thinks that this is the first rated R movie I actually ever saw. but she doesn't listen to the podcast, so now I can admit that, well, I didn't necessarily lie to her. I did selectively omit my restricted film experiences. So yes, sorry, Mom. I saw 3 other rated R movies before I saw Schindler's List. The third of those Cameron-directed films was T2, which I saw at a friend's house. But before I take a deep dive, I found many other people who I talked to recollect that James Cameron was actually a big part of their childhood. Something about the visceral action, the pacing, kind of the cool of the life or death, action extravaganza. It immediately appeals kind of to all boys and girls, actually, of this certain age. I believe it's also funny that each of his films features an empowered female character that, in all cases, proves to overcome something that is, restlessly terrifying for them. I've mentioned before how Cameron's own personal problems may have, been masked by the introduction of these women characters, but I'm not going to get too far down that rabbit hole today. But I also realized that these characters were totally and fully realized in all these films, and also brilliantly portrayed by their respective actors. So I'm referring to Linda Hamilton in the Terminator films, obviously, great. But most importantly for me, to a 9 or 10-year-old boy, I'm talking about Sigourney Weaver. And I'm talking about Lieutenant Ellen Ripley in the Aliens franchise. Or at least the first part of the Aliens franchise. By the way, my 5th rated R movie was the original Alien, which I saw on HBO after I had seen Aliens, and it scared the ever-living shit out of me. As any listener of the podcast knows, it's become a running joke here that I often reference Alien or Aliens. If you're playing Patrick Barrett's New Age drinking game, go ahead and call an ambulance because you're either dead or you're not making it alive from here. But despite my love and reverence for the first Alien, and it's my top 5 films of all time, Cameron's sequel, Aliens, meant more to me as a kid. I wanted the M43 standard issue pulse rifle displayed on my wall. I wanted to be best friends with Vasquez and Hicks and Hudson and Sarge and pretty much everybody. I thought fucking Bishop was cool. And you're like supposed to think that he is a piece of shit and hold a heavy grudge against him for most of the movie, which I couldn't even properly contextualize because I hadn't seen the original film. And still to this day, like when I think of Aliens, I can't help but think Badass. And there's a funny story about Badass, but we'll get back to that. So, a little backstory. Aliens was released on July 18th, 1986, to an almost immediately adoring audience who, frankly, had been skeptical of a sequel to the property, as had the studio. So, Alien had already been considered one of the best science fiction / horror films of all time, and Walter Hill and the other producers of the first film were extremely wary of James Cameron and his then wife, Gail Ann Hurd, who had been essentially, they had crafted this, what was basically a spec script based off of a follow-up to the original film. And the Terminator's success notwithstanding, Hill and the producing partners warmed, basically, through the pre-production process because they understood that Cameron had technical prowess that was basically unparalleled. And based off of the success of his script and Gail Ann Hurd's kind of idea for the story, Sigourney Weaver came back on board as the character Ripley, almost solely because of the power of the script. But his whole thing was it's got to be bigger and it's going to be badder. As the first Alien may have been, analogous for nature versus man, its follow-up would draw hints at cultural imperialism, kind of the pitfalls of going to war arrogant and unprepared. But I still think the major draw, especially to the eyes of an unexperienced child, funny enough, is pacing. Not something you would think about as something that would draw the interest of a kid. But if you know the story beats, I'll go through them really quickly. Ripley is found 57 years later drifting in space, still in cryosleep. She awakes to find a new world that's, been modernized. She starts to reestablish her footing, is drawn back to LV-426 when one of the company men who is helping her reestablish herself mentions that a new colony on the planet has gone out of contact. So, first off, let's talk about Burke. Burke, yes. Okay, motherfucker. Hold on 1 second. I know people who still hate Paul Reiser because of fucking Aliens. I know people who wouldn't watch the sitcom Mad About You because all they wanted was for a fucking xenomorph to burst onto the set and give him what for 24 hours a day, all the time. Count me among those people, although I admit he's a fine actor. He's probably has career hurt for playing one of the slimiest villains in screen history, but I digress. Burke, the Colonial Marine Corps, they go to the planet. It's become infested. They're overwhelmed, and Ripley, who is the only known, she's only been known as a survivor at this point from the first film. She has to strap on her big girl boots and take control of the situation. And of course, throughout the course of this, she meets a young hideaway named Rebecca, or Newt, as you may know her by. And the loss of her own daughter creates a kind of interesting parental bond between the two of them. If you've, watched the extended edition of Aliens, you know this is because Ripley's own daughter passed away while she was in extended hypersleep because of from a ripe old age. I actually prefer the theatrical cut of Aliens. I'll get back to that in a second. Anyways, Marines fight the aliens. Newt gets captured and cocooned. Ripley goes to save her. Finally, it's revealed that a queen alien has been laying these eggs, and they have to basically what I consider is the best third act standoff in film history, and it happens fucking twice. There are other movies that do this. The Matrix is a really good example that has two third act standoffs between the same characters. But Cameron's film is the commitment that Sigourney Weaver shows to absolute badassery. Can you think of any science fiction film that gets nominated for Best Actress? And the answer is no, because it doesn't fucking happen unless you're Kate Winslet in the movie's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Is that sci-fi? I don't think it's sci-fi. Probably not sci-fi. Yeah, it's a stretch. Fucking Sigourney Weaver. Hard sci-fi, aliens. She gets nominated for an Academy Award. Anyway, but she did it while uttering this line.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Yeah, I had a crush on Sigourney Weaver. I still do. It's entirely tied to her character of Ripley. That's A-okay by me. I don't think it's a bad thing to admit. I mean, it's fine, right? Anyways, the film, went on to become a huge hit. It was a cultural milestone for a lot of kids my age, mostly, and that was an adult-oriented film that had such crossover appeal that you could buy action figures of the characters at fucking Toys R Us. You could go into a Toys R Us and buy a fucking action figure of Ripley. But ultimately, the real accomplishment of the film boils down to Cameron's understanding of the property, his commitment to the story, and his absolute technical genius, because while I think Aliens should be shown on the first day of film school for everybody, it's not only written and conceived well, but it's shot well, it's directed well, it's performed well, it's edited well. Production design, score, sound design. I mean, how can you, when you hear something that automatically transports you to a place, I mean, any well-schooled geek can immediately recognize the distinct sound of, yeah, it's a motion tracker, or it's a pulse rifle, or it's a power loader. Even more, the prop work, the special effects that still hold up remarkably well today. The movie has it all. I mean, and in many cases, I think this is why so many wide-eyed 9-year-olds love it. They don't know that they're watching brilliance, but they can feel it. They can understand it in their bones. And as mentioned, the extended edition adds about 20 minutes of mostly expository stuff with Ripley's daughter, a pretty cool sequence with some auto-mounted guns. I can live with all that stuff, but the one part that feels kind of cheap to me is showing the colony before the infestation and how that infestation happened. The reason is because it takes away from the mystery of the thing. Like, I love arriving on an alien planet without the slightest idea of what to expect. Not to mention, the sequence has some of the worst fucking background and model work in the entire movie. This is an instance where I think the editors actually, frankly, got it right. But regardless of what version of the movie you like, it's still magical. It's still badass. So back to the badass thing. I obviously could not own this movie because of its rating but I found a workaround when I was a kid. I didn't have cable, my grandmother did. And one weekend when it was on the local Fox station, I recorded it so I could rewatch it constantly. And I have looked literally all over the internet for this. I cannot find it. But the TV overdubs of the curse words were so ridiculous and so insane. So, pardon my impression, but one of the best parts was as Sergeant Apone is loading up everybody into the drop ship to go. The original line is, "Move them out, move them out, move them out. Absolute badasses." And the Fox TV edit was, "Move them out, move them out, move them out. Absolute bad." Fucking glorious. Best TV overdub of all time. If someone asks if Aliens is in my top 20 films, I'll likely say no. But if someone asked me as a child what film impacted me the most, it's up there. It's always going to be up there. And to that, I will say thank you, James Cameron, for cultivating my childhood. Our guest today is Joshua Rosenfield. Josh is a former colleague of mine from the FSU Film School, is also a trailer editor for the Walt Disney Company, and just kind of extraordinary person altogether. Josh, how's it going?
Oh, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me on. Really a pleasure to talk with you. It's going well, surviving. We all are during this pandemic. Now it
has been a minute. And I apologize in advance for it being so long before we talked. But when we decided to do this sort of offshoot of the podcast where we're talking about 6 properties that explain the New Way podcast, which is basically kind of like the 6 properties that sort of dictate sort of our pop culture compass. One of the ones that kind of immediately sprung to mind was Aliens. And as I know that I believe as of 20 years ago, at least, Aliens was your favorite movie. So I had my first question is Aliens still your favorite movie, Josh?
It probably still is. If it's not, it might be The Abyss, which was like those two always like go back and forth, which one I like the most. But from a storytelling and like an aesthetic design way, Aliens was always something that was formative as a kid.
Right. And I remember us kind of bonding over that and kind of your love for James Cameron pretty early on when we were in school together. So one of the things I'm not even sure that we ever really discussed, but do you remember the first time you watched Aliens? Do you vividly remember that? Like, how old were you? Like, what was the setting? Like, paint that picture for me.
I think it's one of those movies that like was kind of I remember the first time I saw anything from it at all. I remember going upstairs and my parents were watching it, and I walked in on the scene where Bishop is getting impaled and white milk is coming out of his mouth. That's the first thing I ever saw, even before I'd even seen Alien, the first film.
Right.
So that was my introduction to the whole franchise. I must have been watching it on HBO, and this was probably like 1990. It's probably after I saw The Abyss, maybe even.
Mm-hmm. Well, The Abyss was PG-13, so you might have gotten away on that one with a technicality.
Yeah, well, I think it was one of those movies that I ended up seeing in a short succession, but in many pieces. Like over the course of a year, I probably saw the entire movie in its entirety, and then by the end of that year, like I had seen the whole film, and then was so obsessed with it at that point that like I just kept watching it over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you actually saw the full unedited version of it, because one of the things I mentioned in my little monologue was that I had the only way I could continuously watch the movie over and over again is out off of the tape I made at my grandmother's house from Fox, which included some very choice some very choice TV edits of the curse words. But
Oh yeah, you told me. I think you told me a couple of those before. And that was actually a joke at work.
the A poem,
yeah,
absolutely bad. Yeah, that's
we have one of our assistant editors. I've actually retold your story of you telling me that at work, and then him being like, "Oh yeah, I know," because he knows all the ones for like Die Hard and those other Fox films as well. So
that's incredible.
that's really cool.
Well, yeah. So basically, it was kind of a sort of a cumulative experience. It sounded like you just kind of pieced it together, and then eventually, at what point did you realize that it had some sort of, staying power, some sort of real meaning to you, like Aliens?
I think that like the effect of Aliens on pop culture was pretty over the next 10 years, like 86 to like the mid 90s. It was pretty like Aliens, was born out of an aesthetic, I think, in my opinion. Kind of Vietnam War era stuff and all Robert Heinlein, Starship Troopers type stuff. That was kind of the first realization of that. And then like, what do we have after that? We had Doom, a lot of these video games like Quake, they all took inspiration of the Space Marine. Then we actually had Starship Troopers, the movie in the mid 90s, which,
Right.
Was almost a further evolution coming full circle. And that was with a lot of the stuff that I was into as a kid. I was into Star Trek. I was into, science fiction, Space Marines. That whole concept was, building that with Legos and military sci-fi. Then when I got out to Los Angeles, that translated, like, look at the effect that I think you could argue that Aliens had on, like, Sci-Fi Channel's Battlestar Galactica remake. And then later on, now this new thing, The Expanse, like that still has a lot of Aliens DNA.
Yeah.
That television show.
Yeah, I love The Expanse.
So it's a world, and it's I think why a lot of people like Star Wars from the 70s. It's like that grungy aesthetic where things are broken but they're real, and that's Aliens set that tone, and then Aliens brought the military into it, and kind of it's still kind of that kind of lens on, I don't want to say it in a bad way, but like blue culture, like, military people or people who are like in the shipping company, but it's in space. And
right.
It's very grounded and livable.
It feels like a very lived-in universe. It feels like a very tangible and quantifiable thing. And one of the things that I kind of brought up previously is that in my personal film opinion, I think that Alien is a superior film because I think it's nearly a perfect horror movie. I think it's almost a perfect sci-fi movie. It's just like the first time there was really a true marriage of like this high art filmmaking and these two sort of hyper stylized genres. However, I think that Aliens had a bigger impact on me as a kid because I never realized that you could also marry that aesthetic with something that could just inherently be cool and badass and something that would be attractive. Because I mean, honestly, Ridley Scott's Alien is not going to be, immediately attractive to most 9-year-olds, but Aliens was because of the characterizations and because of the the coolness of it. Basically, like you were taking some stuff out of your Saturday morning serial cartoons and with your GI Joes and stuff like that, you were putting them in space.
Yeah, there's a bit of wish fulfillment there. I think for a lot of people, in our era, boys and girls and all of the above, I think took a lot of inspiration from Aliens. I mean, I know I have a lot of coworkers that like that are around the same age as myself. Like those were like really formative, and just now those things are becoming meme worthy. But
of course,
but a lot of fun.
So as far as from a filmmaking standpoint, is there anything that you kind of still get from watching Aliens now that sort of also informs your day-to-day job or like the way that you've approached your professional career, like from a technical standpoint? Or things that you admire about it that you wish you could replicate in any sort of way, shape, or form within sort of an overall artistic medium. Like I know that you have also cut feature films and things along those lines. So I was just interested if that was something that kind of informed anything that you do.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think everything we do artistically is informed by the things that we digest and the things that we,
Yeah.
that we love to see. To say that, whether it's like the way a scene is edited, or the way a shot is composed, or the way framing's used or staging's used in a scene. Those things that you like don't even think about consciously, but if you've seen a movie like 100 times, they become part of your language when you're an editor, at least, especially. Whereas a filmmaker, I think that your preference grows. You have a list of filmmakers that you like, and as an artist, like, you use some of that language to make your own language. But yeah, we also live, especially in trailers, we live in such a nostalgicized world that, like, things that are so ingrained into pop culture, like Aliens,
Right.
or a lot of other Cameron films as well, but everything, Star Wars and Star Trek, and you name it, Game of Thrones, any kind of pop culture that's happening right now, it all kind of we are of that generation that are creating things, and so you find ways to put that touch into things. And I'm seeing things like, oh, that's clearly inspired by Aliens, even now, 30 years later.
Yeah, I mean,
40 years later. 40
yeah.
years. Oh my gosh. Wow.
Oh, we're coming up on 40 years, but we are no spring chickens anymore.
Yeah.
And I had a question about Cameron too, which I'll get to in 1 second. But did you? I'm not sure if you play video games or have. I know that you have a very busy life. But did you play Alien Isolation when that came out?
Yeah, actually, I bought it like a year ago.
Oh, really?
I'm about like a quarter way through it. Yeah, it's just hands down, from like an art perspective and from like just what a cinematic.
I was just going to say my experience playing that, because I bought it right when it first came out and immediately played through the entire game. I've probably played the whole thing 3 or 4 times now. But just the sound design and the muscle memory that kind of takes you back right to this place, which frankly, Alien Isolation, even though the majority of the game, spoiler alert, you're dealing with one alien, the mise en scène, for lack of a better term, in the game is definitely more reminiscent of Aliens than the original Alien. And so I was interested if you had played that.
Yeah, fantastic game. And I know that they had I forget which publisher, developer, which game studio did it, but like they had a lot of they had a lot of cooperation from Fox, and they got a lot of cool like blueprints to rebuild that stuff, those sets from scratch, in their computer environments, and
right? Yeah,
all the sounds and stuff. Probably as authentic as you could get. I know they put a ton of love into that. So
yeah, it seemed very lovingly crafted. Kind of lastly, don't want to take up too much of your time, but
I'll talk your leg off about Aliens.
Of course. One of the things that I found really interesting is because I realized much later, kind of to this coolness, but I realized that like 3 of the first 4 rated R movies I saw as a kid were James Cameron films. They were the Terminator, Terminator 2, and Aliens. Were my first 3 rated R movies. And I'm wondering if you had some sort of similar experience, but what is it that you think that Cameron, as a filmmaker, did to attract such a wide audience? Oh, sorry.
I think it skipped. Yeah.
It's fine. But I was just going to say, what do you think it was that Cameron did to appeal to such a young and wide audience with all of his films? It wasn't just Aliens. Obviously, these other films were huge successes as well.
I think it's like, pushing imagination so far, pushing an insane dream and of an idea into reality with cutting edge special effects. But then the flip side of that is a deep understanding of story and how things work and why they work at certain times, and being very meticulous about, everything being by design, and, understanding how to affect people
Yeah.
in filmmaking. I think
Yeah,
that like,
I
you
gotcha.
know, that all that tied together. I don't know. I mean, I saw The Abyss when I was 7 in the theater. And I just was like, you know, I mean,
So that's an entrancing movie, I would say, more so
yeah,
than
I mean,
Alien.
if that was like Star Wars for me, you know, I saw that movie and it just, I remember driving home and talking to my dad. I was just like, underwater submarine fights? Like, that's a thing? Like,
Right.
even then it was like, you know,
Right.
it's like, I mean, it hasn't even been a thing since, but I just remember it being like so crazy, like all the underwater stuff. And, you know, I was already like super into like the Titanic at this point. Like, I remember when I was 6, like my mom told me that even came like way later, but
Right.
yeah, there's something about the storytelling and the way that he makes you care about a character, you know, like regardless of what's happening, it's like
Yeah.
you care. And you're also when you're watching, I think his films, you also have this tunnel vision of, you completely lose all sense of space and time and you're watching this film, you know.
Sure. And I
when
would
it's
say
over,
that applies to probably even movies like True Lies and things like that aren't even in some sort of like galactic or otherworldly setting.
no, and that movie's great because you forget that it's a spy movie halfway through, and he's just like snooping around and like, you know, trying to figure out what's going on with his wife, and then it turns into a spy movie again.
Yeah.
You know, it gets lost within itself, but it's like, and it all kind of comes full circle, and it, you know, so you know, as a kid,
Yeah.
it was extremely formative. Like it was epic storytelling with a lot of setup and payoff. You know, it was just a lot of fun. Epic stories that stay in your mind and in your heart, like, you know, years and decades after you've seen them. Terminator 2 is the first rated R movie I saw in the theater. I went to an Air Force Base retreat with my Boy Scout group, and my dad was one of the chaperones. And on base, they had a movie theater that had like second run movies. And I guess Terminator 2 had come and gone, and my dad hadn't gotten to see it. And so he's like, hey, you want to go see Terminator 2? And so we went to the theater. And as we walked in, this was like the movie had already been playing, already started.
Right.
He walked in and he told me, he said,
It's the equivalent of what was the 99-cent theater back then, I guess.
yeah, it was the on base theater. And he says, do not tell your mother I let you see this. And so we walk in, and what is the first scene? It's the foster father getting impaled in the refrigerator with the milk, you know. And I'm like, oh my God. But then, like, of course I'm in. And it's just like, it's like, oh, we're going to have a chase on a freeway, and we're going to crash a helicopter into the back of a van, and we're going to flip it over, and we're going to have another act after that where we go. It's just, it's relentless, and it's all tied into character. So
sure.
It's just fantastic. I can take a leg off that.
No, it's all good. Well, Josh, thanks for your time. And thanks for your perspective on it. Obviously, yeah, you know, like, it's one of the two things, like I said, that kind of, I felt like sort of drove my childhood, and I know it did for you too. So I appreciate it. And yeah.
We want to thank our guest, Joshua Rosenfield, for his participation in this little experiment of ours. We will return to our regularly scheduled programming next episode. Until then, this has been 6 Properties That Explain the New Way. Cheers.